Hey everybody, welcome back to Race of History. Today we're going to get into top 10 historical facts that aren't true. Um, we talk sometimes, World War One, World War Two, and even older history about some common misconceptions about certain things. Um, I've done a Sam Onella video, further back about some general misconceptions about history, but I'm interested in this historical facts. So I'm guessing things that literally, everybody believes are true. So I'm curious to hear what they have to say. Let's get into it.
Hello, I'm Simon Whistler. You're watching TopTenz Net, and in the video today we're looking at the top 10 historical facts that aren't actually true. Number 10. Columbus was the first European to discover America. While this old belief has been largely expunged from the historical record today, at one point it was believed as a fact by generations of schoolchildren and is still maintained as true by some adults even today. Of course, the truth is that the Vikings preceded Columbus by centuries and may have even built small villages in the New World.
Yeah, this is taught now at least in the schools that I went to, it was taught that the Vikings came way before Columbus. So this isn't really one of those things that it's certainly not still taught that way. But yeah, I guess in general, if you went around and asked a bunch of random people who discovered America from Europe, they would say probably Columbus. So I guess that's true.
Hundreds of years before Columbus was born. Even if that weren't the case, however, from a purely technical perspective, Columbus never actually touched foot onto what is today the United States, spending all of his time in the East Indies. Number 9. People in Columbus's time thought that the world was flat. Closely related to the belief that Columbus discovered America is the belief, again less prevalent today than it was half a century ago, that most people in his day believed the Earth was flat and
I don't know if the belief is that Columbus discovered America as much as it was just Europeans in general discovering the quote unquote new world. So I don't know if it's a specific to the US type of belief as much as it is just the founding of, what we consider the new world to today. Um, Leif Erikson, is that who was the first Viking leader to set foot in the US? I'm trying to think of who, when I was going through school, who was taught. I can't remember. Leif Erikson is coming in my head, but that may be for something else. So,
if Columbus sailed too far out, he would fall off its edge. In reality, the notion that the Earth was flat had been refuted by the ancient Greeks, who were even able to calculate its circumference with astonishing precision, and so was not held to be a fact by any but the most primitive cultures at the time.
okay, this one is particularly dumb to me because the whole idea was to find the Indies. They're trying to get to India, right? And so if the world is flat, traveling in the opposite direction is sure as hell not going to get you to India. It's going to get you to the bottom of the abyss once you go off the edge of the map, right? And so that one seems a little crazy to me because it literally runs counter to the entire Columbus thing.
Number 8. Hitler seized power in Germany by force. Many people hold the misconception that the Nazis seized power in Germany, but nothing could be further from the truth. The fact is that the Nazis came to power through free and fair elections, and even used the democratic process to secure that power. In effect, Adolf Hitler repealing.
Okay, so do people believe that the Nazis just took Germany? Is that a thing? Um, I don't know if I would say that they did it. I don't know. I feel like the way he's phrasing it makes it seem like it was all done above board, and I don't think that argument could really be made. Um, but they did work. I mean, that was the whole thing with the beer hall push, right? Was that it was kind of a reworking of how Hitler was going to be able to get power, right? How this idea of his, or the general idea of kind of the group at the time, was going to be able to finagle its way into power. And I think initially the thought was to take it by force, but obviously that didn't work, right? And so you have the failed putsch, and then there's this, kind of recalculation of how it could be done. And one of the, there's a lot of different reasons, and historians and economists, especially because the economy of Germany at the time plays such a big role into their politics. But historians and economists kind of argue and lob ideas back and forth on what was more influential and what was less influential. But all in all, there's a certain amount of just things falling the right way that allowed them to gain so much prevalence diplomatically. And I would say that one of those things, one of the big things, was the stock market in the U.S. crashing. The U.S. had essentially been helping kind of hold up the German economy, right? Where they had the reparations for the Treaty of Versailles that was just killing the economy. They had this super high unemployment. Their currency is losing value. So what do? Well, the US makes this massive investment, right? And it turns the German economy around while the US economy is going well. But as soon as the US market starts to fail, then the German market goes into a complete free fall. The German currency goes into a complete free fall. And when you have that much, turbulence, when you have that much uh, strife by the general population, history shows us they are much more willing to go towards the extremes in a lot of different directions, right? And so that's one of the bigger things on the side of the, what would become the major Nazi power taking that step. Because although they had been gaining influence pre US, intervention into their economy, when the intervention into the economy happened, they took a step back. Once the stock market crash happens, once the economy goes into free fall, that's when you see this major diplomatic step taken by the Nazi Party to where they become a a force to be reckoned with, more or less. And another thing that goes in their favor is that when things went poorly, everybody hated the moderates. Everybody hated the moderates. And so the moderates, trying to save themselves, start trying to see who they can bring in that could help them maintain stability. One of the, one of the major people they bring in is Hitler. So
To the very legitimate grievances and fears of the German people, used the ballot box to achieve the powerful position of Chancellor, and then used that very same process to destroy democracy by having the legislature grant him the emergency powers he convinced them was necessary to restore order. Number
again, yes, but that's sort of a miss. I mean, why was that able to pass? Why was when Hitler takes power as chancellor and basically becomes the end all be all, why is it able to pass? In fact, why is there a whole host of, diplomats that aren't even there to vote? And so the idea that it was, you know, if in the upcoming midterms for the US, if one party goes and locks up all of the members of another party, can you really say like we did it the way that the system is set up to do? Like, is that, I don't know. That one seems a little bit far-fetched to me.
7. The stock market crash of 1929 started the Great Depression. Of all the misconceptions surrounding that dark era in American history, the idea that the crash of October 1929 kicks off the Great Depression is the most obstinate. The fact is that the Great Depression was caused by a number of factors, each of which went into making it a deeper and more enduring economic downturn than it would have been otherwise. Instead of letting the market make its own corrections and wait it out, they passed legislation, such as the Smoot-Hawley Act, that raised tariffs on imports, which was designed to make it cheaper to buy American products. The problem is, they didn't anticipate that foreign governments would raise tariffs on American goods in response, thereby killing exports and forcing the mass closure of many factories. Bad government policies also caused many banks to fail, wiping out the life savings of millions of Americans, which further exacerbated the problem. Number 6. Japan had to attack America if it wanted to survive economically. The belief that Japan was largely forced into attacking the United States because of the crippling embargo America had imposed upon it in response to its aggression in China is debatable. Japan had two options available to her other than attacking the Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. First, it could have negotiated an end to her 4-year-long war with China, which Japan was unwilling to do, or it could have simply seized the oil and mineral riches of the Dutch East Indies, modern-day Indonesia, and the Malay Peninsula directly without involving America at all. Consider for a moment that if the US was unwilling to go to war in Europe to assist Great Britain in its struggle with Nazi Germany, what were the chances Congress could have been persuaded to take on the Japanese over the Dutch East Indies and Malaysia? Number 5. If Lee had won at Gettysburg, the South...
Is this history, is this channel a history channel? Because I feel like maybe it's these arguments sound like they're from somebody who doesn't totally understand the context of the situation, right? And so the argument, first off, with the stock market not causing the Great Depression, it's true that there were a lot of things that caused the Great Depression, but he started going in about a bunch of stuff that was already, like, it was happening once the Depression had already started. And so I'm confused about what that was actually in reference to. The deal is, if you have a major stock plunge, what happens to those companies, right? The companies are worth far less. Also, you have demand pullback because people lose money. People who had invested lose money. We're seeing this today with what central banks all over the world are trying to do with inflation, right? Inflation is demand being higher than supply. Okay, so you have demand up here, you have supply down here. And what they try to do with bringing down asset prices is they try to pull demand down to at least the level of supply. Okay? That's the whole thing with how central banks are trying to address the inflation issue right now. Well, when you have the fall of asset prices, like the stock market crash, it pulls demand down, right? Like I said, it's a parallel to today. Why are the stock markets going down? It's because the central banks are going after them. They want to lower demand. So that like exacerbates itself, because when you pull that demand down, what happens? Well, then these companies have too much inventory. They're not selling enough goods, which hurts their stock price more. But also, then they have to start laying people off, right? Because they have too much on their balance sheet for how much they're selling. So then they start laying people off. Well, that laying people off then lowers demand again. And you see how this like cycle starts here. And so the idea that like it wasn't started with the stock market crash, like, yeah, you could argue that there were a couple of different things that, that initially made it as bad as it was. But what the US was doing as far as policy, which I agree, their policy decisions during the Great Depression were garbage. But that just exacerbates the issue. That doesn't stop it, in the Depression or start it. And so that's a little bit weird to me. And here again with the Indies one, it just seems like maybe a little bit of misunderstanding of context.
Would have won the Civil War. It is widely believed that the Union victory at Gettysburg in July of 1863 prevented the North from complete collapse, but a careful look at the overall strategic situation at the time demonstrates this to have been unlikely. First, even if Lee had routed Meade's army at Gettysburg, it would have come at considerable cost, especially considering the number of Union troops Lee faced, over 90,000 compared to his own 70,000 men. This means that even if he had been victorious, Lee would have emerged from the battle with a largely exhausted and depleted force left with which to march on Washington almost 100 miles away. Additionally, Gettysburg would have been only the first in a string of obstacles he would have had to overcome as he moved east. Eventually, he would have to retreat back into Virginia in any case, and though he could add another Confederate victory to the long list of victories Lee had enjoyed up to that point in the war, the South simply couldn't match the North's almost unlimited industrial capability and was doomed to eventually lose in any case. Number 4. Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation freed the slaves. Most students grow up believing that the Emancipation Proclamation freed the slaves, but it did no such thing. First of all, it only applied to slaves living within the Confederate States, and since the North had no power to enforce the proclamation in those territories not under its direct control, it really had no immediate effect on freeing anyone. In fact, it didn't even free those slaves in the northern states, where slave ownership, while uncommon, was still legal. It was only illegal to buy and sell slaves in the North, not own them. It would take the 13th Amendment, ratified in 1865, to do that, and it applied throughout the country, not just parts of it.
Okay, so this is splitting hairs, I feel like. What was the Emancipation Proclamation? It was the freeing of slaves. It was the federal government saying that the institution of slavery within the southern states, which is where it was not dying off. That's where, when it's compared to the North, the issue of slavery was not really an issue in the North. It was an issue in the South. So there's a reason why it was specific to the South. The Emancipation Proclamation did that seems almost like counterintuitive that he specifically referenced the 13th Amendment, but then talked about how there were still slaves in the North. Because, yeah, that seems wild to me. It was the federal government stepping in and saying that where the institution of slavery was the strongest, the widest, and was not planned to die off, it was going to be the federal government's official position that those slaves were to be freed. And so I guess it doesn't outright free them because, yes, you don't have control over the South, but it seems a little odd to me that in the one before this you would argue that the South had no way to win the Civil War, that they were just too industrially behind to compete in the Civil War, but then say the Emancipation Proclamation didn't free the slaves and wasn't really anything because the Civil War was happening. Well, it was the federal government taking a stand, a national stand on slavery, and if the idea was the South had no way to win, then yeah, it did free the slaves, because the whole thing was the second the South capitulates, which is going to happen at some point in time because they have no chance of winning, which is what he just said, then that is that is what it, for all intents and purposes, that is what it does. It doesn't do it that second, but it is what it does. Again, this video has some weird ones to me.
Number 3. Lindbergh was the first person to fly across the Atlantic. While Lucky Lindy won fame and fortune for his daring solo jaunt across the Atlantic in 1927, he was far from the first to cross the ocean by air. In fact, 2 British pilots, Alcock and Brown, had made the crossing years earlier in a repurposed RAF bomber. They flew from St. John's, Newfoundland to Galway, Ireland in just under 16 hours in 1919. That flight paved the way for commercial transatlantic aviation and made Lindbergh's future flight possible. Further, just a couple of weeks after the British duo had made their flight, the British airship R-34, with a couple of dozen crew and passengers on board, made a double crossing, taking about 4 days to cross both ways. In fact, by the time Lindbergh made his world-famous crossing, close to 80 men had already made the epic journey. His, however, was done entirely solo, and clocking in at almost 34 hours of straight flying time was a far more challenging and grueling feat. Number 2. Custer's 7th Cavalry was wiped out at Little Bighorn. While many assume that Custer's entire command was wiped out at the Battle of Little Bighorn in June of 1876, the truth is that less than half of the 647 men under his command were killed in the famous battle. The reason for this was twofold. First, some of his men were assigned to drive and guard the lengthy wagon train that followed in the army's wake, and so were too far away at the time to be involved. And secondly, Custer had divided his command between himself and Major Reno in an effort to make a two-pronged attack. Reno's assault, which preceded Custer's by an hour or so, was driven off with heavy casualties, but most of it emerged from the battle intact. It was only those companies that rode with Custer, about 210 men in all, that were entirely wiped out. Number 1. The USA.
Yeah, I think the last two, the Lindbergh one and the Custer one, are more like people kind of grab on to what the overarching thing is, right? So Custer, quote unquote, gets wiped out, so that's what people grab onto. With Lindbergh, he crosses the Atlantic. That's what people grab onto, right? And so I feel like that's why maybe there's that misconception there. But those are at least misconceptions, like real misconceptions that I agree with.
He was chiefly responsible for defeating Germany in World War I and World War II. While American material and military support was imperative and likely ensured an eventual Allied victory, it was others who bore the brunt of the fighting against Germany in both wars. In World War I, the US was late to the show, not making it to France in significant numbers until late in 1917. It was the British and French who had been doing all of the fighting up until then, and had battered the Germans by the time the US entered the fray. In the Second World War, things were much the same, with American troops not arriving in theatre until very late in the war. While they fought largely rearguard actions in North Africa and Italy, by the time they landed in force in France in June 1944, the Germans were already reeling from the massive Soviet juggernaut that was rolling over them from the east.
That's not the argument. God, Jesus. That's not the argument for World War II. The argument for World War I is a weird one, so I'll give him that one. I'm not really sure what the argument is for why the U.S. I guess you could argue that the Germans had a chance to win before the U.S. got there. I don't personally have that view, but I guess you could at least argue that. But in general, the idea that the U.S. for sure is what made the difference in World War I, that for sure seems like a misconception to me, so I'll give him that one. With World War II, the argument is not that U.S. manpower is what made the difference. The argument is that U.S. manufacturing is what made the difference. And there are economists and historians to this day that will argue that the Soviet Union could not have pushed Germany even out of the Soviet Union without not just U.S., but also British manufacturing. They are getting a ton of everything. They don't have enough boots for soldiers. They don't have enough food. They totally neglected everything for, manufacturing specific war materials. But that means they didn't worry about agriculture. They didn't worry about literally anything except like building tanks, right? Which they did well. But you got to have a ton of oil, which the U.S. is shipping the Soviet Union oil. You got to have trains. You got to have train cars. You got to have some level of infrastructure. You've got to have trucks and jeeps. And I mean, literally, you have to have all this stuff, or else you have no chance of having major offensives move through a ton of territory. You would run into the same problems the Germans have, which is you're relying on basically horsepower to carry your stuff, right? And so the argument is not that U.S. manpower is what made the difference in World War II. It's that U.S. manufacturing is what made the difference in World War II. And now that can be debated and argued, but that just isn't, it wasn't portrayed in that way. Like, that wasn't the way he built it up there. But also, I have a question for everybody in regards to U.S. manpower. So if you were going to take this at face value and say, okay, for sure, the Allies, quote unquote, the Russia-Britain coalition, basically, if the U.S. isn't there, are going to beat Germany anyway, right? If that's the case, and you take that at face value, the U.S. is not involved, what are the chances the Soviet Union stops in Berlin? Like, legitimately, what are the chances that the Soviet Union, if somehow by the grace of God with no help, they push as fast as they do and as big of forces as they do all the way to Berlin, what are the chances they stop there? And what are the chances that they keep going and take literally every foot of land that the Germans had already taken? I'm very curious about what y'all think about that. I think the chances are almost zero that they stop in Berlin, which I don't believe that U.S. manpower made the difference in World War II. I do think U.S. manufacturing made a huge difference, but I don't think U.S. manpower did. I think U.S. manpower made the difference on that, on what the backside of this war looks like, right? Because it goes straight into the Cold War. But I think there's almost a 0% chance that the Soviets stop in Berlin if the U.S. is not involved and there isn't an army coming from the West.
In fact, over 80% of all German casualties in World War II came on the Eastern Front. While it was the US that was chiefly responsible for defeating Japan in the Pacific, it was the Soviet Union that did most of the heavy lifting in Europe. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do give us a like below and also subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. Also, over there on the right are a couple of other videos you'll probably enjoy if you enjoyed this one, and thank you for watching.
Okay, so I'm very curious about whether they actually do history or not, because like I said, this seems like a little bit a person that doesn't really do history talking about history, but if it's not that, I would love to pick his brain on some of his thoughts on this, if he really is a history guy, because I just, my outlook is so different than the way he presented some of these. But overall, good video. At least I had a lot to talk about with it. You guys let me know what you think on all of these. If you think he's right, not right, why or why not. Seriously, the comments, I love listening to what people say and their ideas and all that. So let me know. As always, like, comment, subscribe. Help me keep building the channel over here. I'll put the link to the Discord down below. And I'll see you all next time.